Good evening. Welcome to Estes Online Wednesday night Bible study. The theme of the summer series is Victory in Jesus. Daniel has asked me to talk about a very sacred topic, the cost of victory, to talk about what Jesus suffered, especially in his last day before his death on the cross. We all have heard about the movie in 2004, Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, and you might have heard that expression, Passion of Jesus or Passion of Christ, the Passion of the Christ. When people use passion in that sense, they're using it in its original meaning, which is simply suffering. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, the suffering of Jesus, his physical suffering, his mental anguish, spiritual suffering, emotional suffering. And I do want to offer a disclaimer that I will be showing some slides that are graphic. And another disclaimer that I'm going to show some slides from the movie, The Passion of the Christ. But I acknowledge at the beginning that this movie has historical inaccuracies, it has medical inaccuracies, and it has scriptural inaccuracies. I do not feel like this movie has it all right, but I do think that the images will help bring us to that day and help us realize just how severe the suffering was that Jesus had to endure for us, and he had to endure for victory. So I'd like to start after the Last Supper and when they go to the Mount of Olives. So let's start very simply. So where are we? We're in Israel, and we're in Jerusalem. And you'll notice that the Mount of Olives is to the east of Jerusalem. And if we give a little depth to it, you'll see number 11 there that this is a mountain and has a view of the city. So this is about 9 p.m. on Thursday before his death. And here's where Jesus has foretold that his disciples will scatter and that Peter is going to deny him. Have you ever had to have a very raw and emotional discussion with friends or family about sensitive subjects, maybe even sin? Jesus knows what that's like. We sometimes forget that even these moments had to have been very painful and gut-wrenching for Jesus. He loved his disciples. He loved Peter, and he had to talk to them about their failures, about their sin. And in this, knowing that in a day's time, he wouldn't be there. They had been together for so long, had been through so much, and he knew what was coming, and he knew it was imminent. And here he is having to have these very tough conversations with them. So then we go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and I think about the song, "'Tis Midnight and on Olive's Brow." The Garden of Gethsemane is at the base of, or the brow of, the Mount of Olives. And they go to the garden, and Jesus wants to pray. And again, we think about this story, and we know that he goes to pray and comes back in their sleep, and he's chastises them, and he goes back to pray, and when he comes back, they're asleep again, and this happens 3 times. But I don't think it's hardly possible to overstate how much this hurts Jesus in this moment. This is a very tough moment for him. He says in Matthew 26:38, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." So he goes to pray, to be by himself and pray to his Father. Have you ever been so sorrowful, so sad, so heartbroken that you thought you could just die? Have you ever been that desperate? Have you ever been weak with anxiety and fear? Have you ever collapsed and fallen down to the ground in grief and sorrow? Well, Jesus did. Jesus knows what that's like. He went to the garden and fell to the ground and started to pray. And he says, Abba, Father, if there's any other way, please take this cup from me. But he always says, not my will, but thine be done. He's overwhelmed. He's desperate. He's despondent. Have you ever felt that way? Jesus knows what that's like. Have you ever been so desperate that you want to pray, or you do pray over and over and over again for the same thing, that you pray and look for the result, pray for the same thing again and look for the same result? Jesus does this. He prays, he's begging. And in Luke, the doctor, the physician, he notes that Jesus has such tremendous anguish that he is sweating drops of blood. This is a very big deal. This is intense. This is more intense than almost any of us could possibly relate to. We know what this medical condition is and how it happens. It is very rare. It's hematidrosis. When blood comes out of the pores from the sweat glands, when you have so much adrenaline. Scott Muskelly, in charge of the Lord's Supper a couple of weeks ago, talked about this and mentioned adrenaline. The medical term is catecholamines. And when there's so much of this in your system, then things really go nuts in our body. And Jesus is going back and forth, and he is so stressed out, so anxious, that the capillaries in his pores are bursting and he's dripping blood. This has been documented in recent times. It's been documented in centuries past. There's a documented case of a sailor who had this happen to him when he was in a life-threatening storm. You can imagine how fearful you might be if you were on a boat centuries ago in a life-threatening storm. It happened to him. It has happened to people on death row in the past, and obviously that would be the strongest correlation here. Jesus is in the foreknowledge of his imminent death, and he knows the anguish, he knows the physical pain that's coming. I think it's worth talking about here that this is proof that Jesus was not immune to fear. I want to pull back just a second and talk about something unrelated. Some of you may have watched a documentary called Free Solo. This is about Alex Honnold. He's an American rock climber, mountain climber, and he climbed the face of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park with no safety equipment whatsoever. Thousands of feet in the air with only millimeters of grip on each hand, on just a few fingers, and just millimeters of grip in the tips of his shoes. It does not seem possible that somebody could do that without panic. Well, interestingly enough, they studied his brain, and the fear center is called the amygdala, and his was not working like ours works. And that seems to fit together with this feat, that he would be able to do that and do it without panic. Well, his panic button is missing. His anxiety center is not normal. And maybe that is exactly why he could do something like that. Well, Jesus didn't have that. His amygdala was normal. It's like yours and like mine. He didn't bypass the fear and anxiety. This is proof, the garden is proof that he is a normal human being that felt every ounce of anguish and did not bypass that. He suffered that, and he did that for you, and he did that for me. So he goes back, and his friends are asleep, and he says, you can't stay awake. You know, your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. You need to pray. And then he leaves again, and he does this again, begging God, except to say, let your will be done and not mine. And then when he goes back, after his second stint of praying, they're asleep again. And I can only imagine that he just shakes his head and then goes back again to be by himself and pray. And again, the heartache that must be present in this moment. I can't imagine facing death within a mere matter of hours, and my best friends in the world seem to not even care. They fall asleep. That had to hurt. And so when he comes back again, he says, wake up. The time has come and the betrayer is at hand. So yet again, here's a moment that I think a lot of us can relate to. Have you ever prayed fervently, prayed desperately for something, and the answer was no? God did not grant Jesus his request in this case. And he had to know, that God was going to have his way, and that Jesus couldn't have his way, except to say that he always ended with, your will, not mine. God did send an angel to comfort him, and sometimes that's what happens for us. He will give us what we need to have the strength to get through our trials. If he's not going to remove them from us, he will give us what we need to get through them. So then we have the betrayal. Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. And we know the things that happen here, but we're not going to go through every detail of how this all goes down, because we're going to concentrate on the aspects of suffering. But the guards that are watching over Jesus, they blindfold him and they start to mock him, spit on him, slap him around. This is humiliating to read about that, and to consider that the Son of God, our Savior, was treated in that way is awful to think about. Have you ever been bullied? Some of you might have been. It's got to be an awful feeling. I'm really glad that there's a lot more awareness about bullying, but it still seems to go on and be ubiquitous. So I know that there are people out there that have experienced it. Just know that Jesus knows exactly what that feels like. So just think about how humble that he had to be to take that, to endure that embarrassing moment. And think about the fact that he's the creator of these people. He created them. And this is how they're treating him in the most humiliating way. And he was betrayed. Have you ever been betrayed? Betrayal is a horrible feeling. And he was betrayed by one of his apostles, one of the 12. Have you ever had one of your friends turn your back on you? You know, Peter denied Jesus. And all of this is happening in the worst moment. And he's carried from place to place. This trial is a sham. Goes from Annas to Caiaphas to the Sanhedrin to Pilate, who sends him to Herod, who sends him back to Pilate. There's so many lessons in all of this, and so many lessons in how Jesus behaved and how humble he was and how quiet he was. And there's a lot of good lessons there, but we're going to concentrate on the suffering aspect of these stories. On that note, though, keep in mind that throughout all of this, then he is experiencing sleep deprivation and increasing dehydration. These things are adding up already. He's sweating blood, he's up all night, and he is in the beginnings of dehydration by the time the real beatings begin. So, have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? That in and of itself is very hurtful. It's maddening. It's especially maddening if you're found guilty of something that you didn't do. Just recently, I was talking with somebody I care about a lot, and she was called into her boss's office. And the boss said to her, "Did you apply for unemployment?" And she said, "No, because I'm not unemployed." "Why do you ask?" And to fast forward a little bit, what they discovered was her identity had been stolen. And obviously that's a very big deal. But then when the dust settled, she had to look at her boss and his secretary and ask, "Did you think that I did that?" And they said, for a little while, "Yes, we were convinced that you had." That destroyed her. It was extremely hurtful to have been accused and in their hearts found guilty of something that she didn't do. So keep in mind what this all felt like to him. We talk about the timeline, and sometimes we do that in a disconnected way. This is extremely humiliating. And of course, the Jews that are pushing all of this are his people, God's chosen people. This is all a very hurtful thing for him to witness, and he has to take it with great humility. So he's found guilty, and then he's turned over to be scourged. The scourging is very hard to think about. It's very hard to talk about. He's found guilty and turned over. I found lots of images for Roman scourging equipment, for flogging equipment, for what's called a flagrum. None of them look good. None of them look any better than the next. All of them include leather strips that have any number of things attached to them to inflict maximum damage and pain. Sharp objects, heavy objects, Uh, this is an incredible, incredible moment. Luke in his record uses a word whose original meaning implies flaying open, which is what scourging does. It's what it did. So there's not only cutting and lacerations and ripping and tearing, but blunt force trauma. There's obviously the bruising, the laceration, but it probably fractured ribs. I can't even imagine going forward with the things that he had to do next with one broken rib. In college, I broke a rib. I was a wimp for 6 weeks straight. Yeah, I just couldn't do anything without whining or complaining. 2011, I was in a fairly significant car accident. I did not suffer any dangerous injuries, but the sudden stop, caught with my seatbelt and that trauma from the sudden stop, I was so sore that it was hard to get up out of a chair, to sit down in a chair, to lay down in a bed, much less go through all of the other things that happened after this. So one of the books that I used to prepare for this lesson was written by a Dr. Frederick Zuckerby, and he is considered one of the foremost authorities on the physical aspects of Jesus' sufferings. And he's a forensic pathologist. So he has an intimate knowledge of injuries and trauma that cause death and what that looks like. So he describes an autopsy of what had been a healthy young adult who sustained injuries from abuse with a belt and an electric cord. This is terrible to talk about. I understand that, but this is what our Lord went through. And so in an autopsy with a belt and an electric cord, there was hemorrhaging or bleeding in the back muscles, in the triceps, in the muscles and tissues between each rib. And the lungs themselves had bleeding, profound bleeding, and pneumothorax or a collapsed lung. So you can imagine the amount of damage that's done with one of these flogging devices. Jesus endured an abnormal amount of scourging, and this was a tremendous blow to his physical body. This is extensive trauma, and set off a chain of events that led to his death. And I hope that no one listening has ever endured this level of beatings or physical abuse. But there's bound to be someone that hears this lesson that has had some amount of physical abuse. Know that Jesus Christ knows what that feels like. Profound bleeding. And he's then placed with a crown of thorns on his head. So I think of songs like "O Sacred Head" and "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." And they strip this clothes off, which is humiliating. And then they mock him with the crown of thorns. They spit on him. This is after being beaten and flogged. They do all of this. This is one thing after another. I mean, just absolutely abused and whipped and beaten. And then let's make this crown of thorns and put it on his head. They've estimated anywhere from 20 to 30 to 70 thorns that might have had contact with his scalp. Some have theorized that it was actually an entire covering like a cap instead of just a ring, which is possible. But the innervation of the scalp, or the amount of nerves and nerve endings in the scalp, is profound, as is the vasculature or the blood vessels of blood supply to the scalp. So this had to hurt so bad. Just take one thorn off of a bush in your yard, one pin, and stick it in your scalp and see how many times you can do that in a row. Zuckerby in this book hypothesizes that Jesus had to have experienced the most severe form of what we call neuropathic pain that comes from nerve damage. The trigeminal nerve, that is one of the two major nerve supplies to the face and head, could have easily sustained enough damage to cause excruciating pain. Anyone listening that's ever had flare-ups of trigeminal neuralgia would know exactly how bad that pain is. And I think that's highly likely. The crown of thorns is not a small part of Jesus' suffering for our sake. And then they take a rod and start beating him on the crown of thorns. That's incredible. And he doesn't lash out. He's not fighting back. He's taking it. He's taking it for you and for me. He does every bit of this out of a profound love for you and for me. Can't imagine what it'd be like to even place it gently on my head, much less have people come and rack it with a rod as hard as they can, several times over, and humiliate him and spit on him. He has already at this point suffered the most profound abuse and beatings. And then he has to carry his cross. I think of the song, "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone?" So a lot of authorities, as it were, believe that Jesus did not carry an entire cross, but just the horizontal portion called the patibulum. But we don't know that for sure. The stipe, or the vertical piece, could have likely already been in place. That would not have been uncommon. But even if it was just the horizontal piece, it probably weighed at least 100 pounds, and he had already been beaten bad enough. Can you imagine how raw his skin on his back had to have been, and then to have to carry this wooden cross tie almost? Profoundly weak at this point, and no wonder, the things that are happening to his body at this point are overwhelming. And to still have enough strength to even try is beyond me. like I said, I have this wreck and I'm so sore, I don't even want to get up out of the chair. And here he has to carry this heavy load. And of course, we get to the crucifixion. Here's an image of him carrying that piece. I can't hardly imagine what this could have felt like. We don't know precisely where the nails went. We don't know precisely what the nails look like, but there's a strong chance the nail looked just like this. To a degree, obviously, it hardly matters if he was crucified between the radius and the ulna, or between the wrist bones, or in the palm, or like this picture depicts. It had to be terrible any way you do it. This is awful. It's hard to imagine. This is a very difficult image. This elicits pain just by looking at it. I think of the song, "Can He Still Feel the Nails?" That brings a lot more meaning to it when you really consider what this had to do. This is a very likely position of the nailing. Dr. Zugabe hypothesizes again regarding the possibility that the nails in the hands affected, maybe even severed the median nerve, which is what we all know to be involved with carpal tunnel syndrome. It almost seems trivial to mention carpal tunnel syndrome in light of this, but to give you reference of the anatomy here, carpal tunnel syndrome can be pretty bad, but to have this metal spike grinding against the nerve, there's a condition called causalgia, and it's basically means a serious, the most serious type of nerve pain or neuropathic pain that you can experience, which you can imagine direct trauma to the nerve would be over the top pain. I could only imagine that I would pass out or throw up. It's unimaginable to think about what that would be like. Of course, the Romans did this on purpose, though. This was by design. This was supposed to inflict maximum pain and maximum damage. And to consider that type of nerve pain on top of just the pure trauma of the puncture is unimaginable to me. You may have figured out that in the background is an image of someone holding the nail to Jesus' hand. And in the filming of The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson dressed out so that he personally could hold the nail in this scene to represent his accepting his role in the crucifixion. And as we contemplate these matters, I think that's a very good application of this lesson, is why this happened and our part in it, and how our sin necessitated such a sacrifice. And the nails in the feet, the same picture with the plantar nerve. And again, we could go through the debate about whether there were nails in the feet or whether they were tied or whether the feet were together overlapped with one nail, or whether they were separate with two nails, or whether they were to the side of the stipes with nails through the side, or in between the Achilles heel or the Achilles tendon. But none of that hardly matters. I do believe personally that there were two nails, one in each foot, and that he endured maximum pain with each nail. And I hate to think about it that way, but I think that's what happened. And I'm eternally grateful that he would do that for me. So then he's suspended. Here again is that same picture in the background. And, I picture me holding that nail, and it might as well be me. It might as well be you. It might as well be me instead of Peter denying Christ because I've done it and you've done it. It might as well be me mocking Jesus, because even if you or I haven't directly made fun of him, a lot of our choices have accomplished the same result. And so it's very humbling to think about personally being responsible for holding the nail or for driving the nail. But it might as well have been me personally, because it's the same. So suspended, there's a lot we could talk about here. There's a lot going on. The nails are tearing into the flesh. They're pulling. They're grinding against nerves. There's a lot of muscle cramping that must have been going on at this point. This Dr. Zugaby performed pretty impressive experiments to do the best duplication of this kind of position on different subjects to see how it affected breathing and different things. Well, one of the most noticeable findings was the muscle cramping, and how there was absolutely no way to find any relief. So compound that with 4 nails in your body, and there's no way, no hope to get any relief. And then in this position, there's extra stress and tension and all of the writhing and position changing to cause muscle cramping and discomfort. That's on top of everything else that's happening. And you can imagine if his back did make contact with the wood, how terrible that would be. Imagine what it was like for them to strip the robe off of his bloody back when the blood had to have dried some. We know a tiny amount of what that would be like if we pulled a Band-Aid off of a dry scab and ripped a scab off. It's hard to imagine what just taking the robe off was like. Well, then he's hanging on the cross, and what that had to have felt like on his body. The nails, the crown of thorns, it's just unimaginable. And there's absolutely no chance of relief or a comfortable position. So from noon to 3, darkness fell. And the same person that when he was 12 said, "I have to be about my Father's business," then cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And how would we ever know what that felt like? To have shouldered the sin and guilt of the world, and to have his Father in heaven forsake him in that way. The pain of that moment is profound. And all of these things that he's experiencing, watching his loved ones break down, to watching him suffer, and then these moments, my God, why have you forsaken me? We just can't know fully just how bad this was, but we can contemplate it, and we can meditate on it, and we can use a study like this to help us focus. We can use a study like this to help us understand just what it took for him to shed the blood that saves us from our sins. And again, some of us, and some of you, have experienced tremendous pain. I work in a pain clinic, and I have seen people suffer from incredible problems, from incredible damage, from incredible trauma. And I know some of you watching deal with chronic pain, and or have been hurt in very traumatic ways. But Jesus volunteered for this, and he did so out of love. This was intentional. God did this intentionally. And that is an incredible thought. So, what is your response? What is your response to Jesus' suffering? What is your response to meditating on this study? What is your response to his doing these things willingly? What is your response to considering the emotional sacrifice that he went through, much less the physical sacrifice that he went through? Well, I think number one, if you have not decided to put Jesus on, you have not decided to die with him in baptism to be raised again, that should be your response. He did this so that you can have forgiveness of sins. Your response may need to be changing your life. Your response may need to be changing your thinking. Your response may need to be changing your heart. This should make you want to be more like him in a most desperate way. To know that he would do this for you, what are you willing to do for him? And if nothing else, your response should be to get on your knees and offer thanks for God's willingness to sacrifice his only son, and for Jesus' willingness to sacrifice his life, to go through all of these things for you, for me. So on that note, I would like for us to end with a prayer. Let's bow. Dear awesome God, we are humbled every time we reflect on your sacrifice, sending your only son for us. Your grace and mercy overwhelm us when we think about it, and we offer our deepest thanks for Jesus, his willingness to suffer this excruciating agony, and to go through all of that to save us, to be with us in eternity, to reconcile us to you, to bleed, to die, so that we can be clean, so that we can be guiltless, so that we can be righteous in your eyes. We know we don't deserve it, and we bow down and worship to you and in thanks. We need you. We need you every hour. Please help us to walk in the light and to be mindful of Christ's sacrifice for us. Help us to be affected by his sufferings, to be affected by his sacrifices. Help us to change our hearts because of what all he did for us. Help us to shine his radiance into the world. Make us instruments and use us. Help us to surrender to your will in our lives. We love you so much. We pray in your perfect Son's name. Amen.